welcome. My name is Susan Combe, and I am the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Alumni Relations at Washington University. On behalf of the Alumni Association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Wednesdays with WashU, a conversation with NASA astronaut Robert Behnken. We're excited to co-sponsor this event today with the McKelvey School of Engineering. Following the interview, we will have plenty of time for questions. You may submit questions at any time in the Q&A box during the talk. We also encourage you to utilize the chat function to introduce yourself, share your affiliation with the university and where you're viewing from. When you send a chat, please make sure to select panelists and all attendees so we all get the message. The webinar is being recorded and we'll share it on the Alumni Association website and the YouTube channel following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Aaron Bobick, Dean of the McKelvey School of Engineering. As the James M. McKelvey Professor, Dean Bobick came to Washington University in 2015. Prior to WashU, he was the founding chair of the School of Interactive Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Dean Bobick earned his bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science and his doctorate in cognitive science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming Dean Aaron Bobick.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. In partnership with the Washington University Alumni Association, McKelvey School of Engineering, Chancellor Martin and I are delighted today that we have Colonel Bob Behnken as the featured speaker for today's webinar. And before I introduce you, Bob, let me say it's particularly appropriate to have you with us today as America celebrates Veterans Day. And we offer thanks to you and all our alumni who have served in the military. A St. Louis native, and it's Pattonville High for those of you who want to know where everyone in St. Louis went to high school. Bob is someone that we've been looking up to, both metaphorically and literally, for decades. Bob distinguished himself as a student here, earning bachelor's degrees in mechanical engineering and engineering physics. When he graduated in 1992, he was named the Outstanding Mechanical Engineering Senior. He then attended the California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech, where he earned a Master of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering in '93, followed by a PhD in 1997. Bob was commissioned via the Air Force ROTC, and his career included a number of interesting assignments, including managing and developing new weapon systems, as well as serving as lead flight test engineer for the 4th F-22. He has flown more than 1,500 flight hours in more than 25 different types of aircraft. Colonel Behnken was selected by NASA in July 2000, and after completing astronaut candidate training, he served in the exploration branch as the chief of the Space Station Operations Branch. And between July 2012 and 2015, Bob was NASA's chief astronaut. He's trained as an International Space Station crew member following the loss of Columbia and served as a flight engineer on the International Space Station for Expedition 63. He's also a veteran of 2 space shuttle flights, STS-123 in March '08 and STS-130 in February 2010, having logged more than 700 hours in space and having performed more than 37 hours in 6 spacewalks. As many of us recently watched, Bob was most recently served as Joint Operations Commander on the first crewed flight of the SpaceX Crew Dragon, the Demo 2 mission, which landed August 2nd, 2020. What was really cool, I gotta say, during that time in space is he recorded a welcome message for McKelvey Engineering's incoming students. And I'd like to play that for you now.
To the new students at Washington University, hello from the International Space Station, 250 miles above Earth. I'm NASA astronaut Bob Behnken, flight test engineer and Joint Operations Commander for SpaceX's first crewed mission to space. I'm also a proud Washington University engineering alum. First, let me congratulate you on being admitted to the McKelvey School of Engineering and deciding to join the school. If you have dreams of designing new devices, working in healthcare, running a technology business, or even becoming an astronaut, your engineering education is a critical piece of your future. Washington University has a lot to offer, both inside and outside the classroom, and when I think back to my time on campus, it was the hands-on opportunities outside the classroom that turned out to be the most valuable throughout my career. I found things in science, mathematics, and engineering that inspired me, and I encourage you to explore the many opportunities at Washington University as you pursue what you are most passionate about. As an engineer, you will see connections between solving problems and benefiting society. You'll challenge assumptions and be innovative. And if you work hard, you'll be a great engineer. I'm sure you'll also find a little time to enjoy the local area and maybe even eat some toasted ravioli or other St. Louis favorites. You'll meet new people and start lifelong friendships. But most importantly, search for your inspiration. Strive for excellence in what you do. And of course, reach for the stars. As I prepare for my journey back to Earth, I wish you all the best as you begin your journey at Washington University.
Yeah, so take that, Georgia Tech. In recognition of his achievements, Bob received the Engineering Young Alumni Achievement Award in 2009 and the university's Distinguished Alumni Award in 2013. And we're incredibly honored to have him with us here today. Thank you for joining us, Bob. At this time, it is now my pleasure to introduce Chancellor Andrew Martin, who will moderate the conversation. Chancellor Martin was appointed Washington University's 15th Chancellor by the Board of Trustees in July 2018 and began his tenure in 2019. From 2014 to 18, he served as the Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and Arts at the University of Michigan. Prior to departing to a school with worse weather but a bigger football stadium, Chancellor Martin was Professor Martin, serving on Washington University's faculty in various positions, including as the Charles Nagel Chair of Constitutional Law and Political Science at the School of Law, Vice Dean of the School of Law, Founding Director of the Center of Empirical Research in the Law, and Chair of the Department of Political Science in Arts and Science. Chancellor Martin earned his PhD in Political Science from Washington University in 1998 and his AB from the College of William and Mary in Mathematics and Government in 94, an interesting combination that went on to inform his research career. I want to say that at Chancellor Martin's inauguration last fall, he selected the theme of momentum, and there was a focus on leveraging the current strength and power of WashU to move forward and create impact. But as Colonel Behnken knows as a mechanical engineer, one's momentum is the result of the sum of the forces that have acted upon you in the past to get you to your current state. During these challenging times, Chancellor Martin has had to navigate truly uncharted waters. But I will say the strength of everything that has been WashU until now has provided the momentum that he needs to not only get past all these challenges, but to guide us to emerge stronger and more determined as we come out the other side. So all, please join me in welcoming Chancellor Martin and Colonel Behnken.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dean Bobick. And Colonel Behnken, thank you for being with us today. It is a real honor to be able to have this conversation with you. You have made both Washington University and St. Louis so proud for many, many years. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in St. Louis and how your experiences growing up here shaped you as a person?
Absolutely, Chancellor Martin, and thank you, Dean Bobick, for the introduction there. As you noted, in addition to being a Washington University alumni, I also grew up in the St. Louis area. I grew up and went to the Pattonville High School and the Pattonville School District, and was really lucky that school actually had the strong math and science education curriculum that they do have at that school. I was really lucky to get a couple of years of physics and a couple of years of chemistry in a high school setting, as well as calculus, which isn't something that everyone has the opportunity to do. And I've been thankful for that. And certainly being exposed to that level of education really motivated me to continue to pursue those areas of education as I continued moving forward. At the same time, my father was a construction worker as I grew up and transitioned to construction education as he continued on with his career. But during my formative years, there was a lot of manual labor and construction activity that I was able to be a part of. And that combination, if you will, of strong education from the Pattonville School District, as well as the hands-on activities that my father instilled in me, I think really set me up for the kind of work that I ended up doing, which was, assembling the International Space Station or working with a team out at SpaceX to build a new rocket and build a new spacecraft to get our crews rotated up to the International Space Station.
So you come from Pattonville to Washington University. Tell us a little bit about your experience here on our campus as a student. Are there a particular professor or mentor that was really crucial to your time here at Washington University?
Absolutely. I had a couple of really wonderful faculty members that really set me up, I think, for success. I think they're no longer with Washington University, but I know in their current roles elsewhere, they are continuing to inspire, generations of students going forward. John Hochstein was a fluid mechanics, mechanical engineering instructor and professor. And he actually had research that was space-based, I think really focusing on developing new tanks to use in low Earth orbit and low gravity situations. And he was my faculty advisor in the mechanical engineering department. In addition to him, I had Richard Rabbit, and Richard Rabbit really supported the students as we participated in a series of activities through the Society of Automotive Engineers that allowed more hands-on education, if you will. There was a natural gas vehicle challenge. There was a methanol car that was developed. I think after I moved on, there was a hybrid electric vehicle. Those activities, I think, really turned our education into hands-on activities that, we really had real problems or real situations where we needed to apply our physical understanding to kind of address a need that was in front of us and take advantage of our education and really put it to work. Engineering just really doesn't live inside of a book exclusively. It needs to be able to reach out and embrace and tame the real world. And so getting exposed to that early in my experience, rather than waiting until I was off working in a job somewhere, was really critical for me to be successful and probably shape the direction that I chose from a career perspective.
So at what point in your life did you first think about becoming an astronaut?
Chancellor, I get asked that question a lot. You might imagine over the 20 years that I've been wearing this blue suit and been in the astronaut office. And I'll have to say I kind of have two answers. Of course, as a child, I had the dream of being an astronaut, but I also had the dream of being a rock star and being a race car driver and all those things. And I'll say that that astronaut dream kind of got put away, kind of got put in a compartment until I got a little bit older, once I kind of got out of grade school. And for me, basically, it came about again when I was a student at the Air Force Test Pilot School, and all of my classmates were applying to be astronauts, because that's what a lot of folks do out at Edwards Air Force Base. Is they've been chasing that dream their entire life. And that really was the first time that I was competitive to fill out an application. And in no small measure, I think as well, I had completed my education out at Caltech and had a classmate who had already been selected. And I think there was a little bit of my motivation that was based on him being successful. And I was confident that if he could be successful, so could I.
So if you think about engineering at a real fundamental level, engineering is about problem solving. And I'm sure that over the course of your career, you've solved many problems, big and small. You tell us about one of those unexpected problems that you've encountered and the approaches that you use to solve it?
I will say, Chancellor, that I came back to Washington University a few years ago and gave a presentation to the mechanical engineering department describing the challenge that we faced as we tried to recover from the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and how we addressed that problem and how we really had to take a step back. I think sometimes engineering is described as problem solving, but sometimes folks could better understand it as trying to understand the physics or the physical world or that we live in and trying to apply that to a need. And sometimes the problems are when we realize that we didn't understand the world as well as we thought we did, or there might be a unique need that we can take advantage of our understanding to address. In the space shuttle case, it was that initial situation where we didn't understand the world as well as we thought that we did. some foam insulation that has a little bit higher density, but not much, than a kind of a styrofoam cooler had come off of the external tank and impacted the space shuttle. And folks really believed that a small piece of foam could not damage a hard surface that was a composite reinforced carbon-carbon, really stout piece of structure in the way that it did. But we had to take a couple of steps back and really realize that the physical world that we thought we understood wasn't really the way that it was, and had to address it. And so the challenge for those sorts of problems, I think we often think about, hey, as an engineer, I, as an individual, will be able to put the pieces together, and I'm going to make the breakthrough, and I will solve this problem, or I will create a new product by myself. It really does take a team in most major engineering successes to come together and pool their understanding and address the specific issue or the need that's out there. And we really had to do that with that space shuttle problem. As you might imagine, there were thousands of people who were participating with that and trying to figure out how information was going to be brought together. And those were problems that needed addressing. And in many cases, they were more challenging than the underlying physics. We could build an experiment, we could take a piece of foam and we could hit the leading edge of reinforced carbon-carbon and show the physical phenomenon of what was going. We could do a whole bunch of series of tests and really pound flat our understanding. But we needed to take a step back and figure out, okay, culturally, as a group who makes decisions, how did we make such a poor decision, and address that problem as well? And there was an engineering facet to that. There's other facets of that had to be taken apart as well. And so it was good to both go through that for me as an individual, and it was also, I think, very valuable to be able to share that message when I came back to Washington University and the other groups that have been able to kind of dissect that problem. And I'll take you one step back. I don't want to have too long-winded of an answer, but I was a child when we lost the Space Shuttle Challenger, and that process had to play out for that space shuttle disaster as well. And so for me as a student, it's kind of strange to say this, not very many high school students would be riveted to C-SPAN or the nightly news the way that I was, but I was, because there were hearings that talked about the both the technical and the personal failings that had led to the loss of Challenger, and I was deeply interested in that as a high school student, interestingly enough, and kind of saw it play out again as I was a part of the Columbia accident investigation.
So you've been on 3 space flights. How do you prepare for these flights, and did the preparation for the most recent flight differ from the ones previously?
I appreciate that question. We get asked a lot as astronauts, how do we do our missions? How do we prepare for them? My goal as an astronaut, and probably the best way to describe it is to take you back to maybe a movie analogy, and it's getting to be a dated movie analogy at this point, but there's a movie that's called Groundhog Day, where each day the individual is kind of forced to relive over and over the same day. And he tries to create different outcomes by understanding what's going on that day in special ways, and try to get to where he's trying to get to by the end of the day, kind of doing different activities. And he tries everything as he works through it. I think our preparation as astronauts is very similar in that our goal is to do everything in a simulated world in preparation for our mission, so that we're not surprised by things when they do happen to us on orbit. And so we really try to gain as much experience as we can going through our training flow, so that when we go out for a spacewalk, or we go out to do robotics activities, grabbing a satellite or a cargo vehicle and docking it to the International Space Station, it's all things that we've seen before, and that we're comfortable with what the next step should be, no matter what we actually do see. Now, this is a balance, because at the same time, we're executing science on board the International Space Station. And so when we do that science, we don't really structure that in a way that we only get the expected results and the tests are boring. We do try to make sure that we can operate the experiment in a fashion that it stays inside of its bounds of unexpectedness, if you will. But that's really what we try to train to do, is that repetition from a simulation perspective so that we are prepared. And most of the mission is very much like Groundhog Day.
So
For the mission that I just went through, the SpaceX mission, that one was a little bit different in that the team that we were working with out at SpaceX hadn't been through that sort of a development cycle before. And so they were learning how to do training of astronauts. They were learning how to do a flight test of a brand new vehicle in a manner with humans involved that they hadn't been through before. They had launched to the space station before, but not with people on board. And they've had a lot of rocket success, but again, not with people on board. And so we had to work through all of those facets as well. In some sense, we were a payload that talked back and had opinions about what the risk we were about to face was. And that was just a very different way of doing business that they had to get comfortable with and embrace to be able to move forward. And we've got to launch this weekend to, take the next step and continuing down that path.
So what's the thing that you remember most about your first time going into space?
The thing I remember most about my first flight was liftoff. And during that liftoff, it was a night launch, which there were not very many of at the time because we needed to take good imagery of the space shuttle to make sure that none of that foam came off again and hit the leading edge of the space shuttle, or if it did, that we were prepared to inspect and jump right into making sure we could address that problem. So it was a night liftoff, and there was a very thin layer of clouds. So my guests got to see about 17 to 20 seconds of the actual launch before we were disappeared and were gone. But the thing that I remember most is, of course, the vibration and the motion as we got off the launch pad. And then something that was not what I expected happened. It didn't play out the way that I had hoped from a training perspective. We got a lot of messages, cautions and warnings on the space shuttle itself telling us that there was a problem with the control system for our attitude. And at the same time, a bunch of orange light came through the windows. And so, in my world, we think about confirming cues and whether or not those two things go together and mean something even worse, or they don't go together, and then things are a little bit more controlled or a little bit more relaxing. But all that orange light initially led me to think that, well, maybe those messages are telling us that we're having a bad day here on our space shuttle missions. The guy who sat next to me on the space shuttle, he described it as all that orange light came in and it seemed like we were storming the gates of hell. But for me, I was focused on the technical thing in front of us, which all those messages had come off, and now I see the indications of fire. Is that real? And the thing that my training did provide for me is I looked around the cockpit, and the other folks in the cockpit were all continuing to execute the mission. Even if we were on fire, we had things that we could do about that. Turns out that we weren't, but we continued marching down the path of knowing what to do next and worked through the mission. As we looked through it, and played the mission back off of the audio that we had from the liftoff time frame, it turned out that orange light that came in was actually just our rocket plume lighting up those clouds that we were flying through. And all those messages that came up, we really did have an attitude control problem, but it was one that the vehicle could handle, the space shuttle could handle, and still get us into orbit. And it was based on a computer card that had vibrated out of a computer inside of the vehicle after, the 20 plus previous missions that it had been on. It hadn't vibrated out, but it did on ours. And so that's the most memorable thing for me.
So in your last mission, what were your responsibilities when you were on the SpaceX vehicle? And then what were your responsibilities once you got to the International Space Station?
I was the pilot of the Crew Dragon vehicle, the first pilot of the vehicle. And my primary responsibilities were, from a flight test perspective, to make sure that we accomplished all the test objectives. And that included some manual flying that the commander did, and I monitored and kept track of how much fuel we were using and where we were relative to the space station as that was all accomplished. Monitored the docking system as we came in to ensure that it performed the way that it was supposed to. Really, the details of that aren't so interesting, but suffice it to say, all those test points needed to get done, and somebody had to keep track of them and remind folks if we didn't get one of them taken care of. So I did that throughout the ascent and the entry of the Dragon capsule. Once I was on board the International Space Station, I was another pair of science hands or maintenance hands. And so for me, it was very exciting to be able to fill that role. I had been an assembly person for the International Space Station on my shuttle missions. So spent a lot of time bringing new modules up and getting them checked out and attached, but hadn't really lived on the space station as a crew member performing science and really taking care of the space station the way that you need to if you want to keep it in orbit for 20 or 30 years. And so I got to do quite a bit of that, including 4 additional spacewalks to upgrade a series of batteries that have been up there for a few years and hopefully put space station in a good posture for another decade of life.
So as you look 10, 20 years down the road, what do you see as the future for human spaceflight?
I kind of see 2 branches for human spaceflight. On one branch is kind of the low Earth orbit and where we are with the Dragon vehicle and SpaceX, and where we'll soon be with the Boeing vehicle and the CST-100 Starliner, where we can get into orbit and those vehicles are reusable so that they can fly again, which when they're reusable and they can fly again, that drives the cost down and provides opportunity for more people and more missions to make it into low Earth orbit. At the same time, I kind of see a parallel thing happening, which is most likely a return to the moon and continuing on to Mars and continued deeper exploration of our, away from low Earth orbit, if you will, that will really be a prime place for NASA to really focus on. I'm sure you've heard of the Artemis program. Some folks have at least. And there's a new effort with a human lander system to go back to the moon. And there's an aggressive date out there to get that accomplished by. And I see that pathway happening at the same time as this exciting phase, which is a lot more people being able to get to low Earth orbit.
So we celebrated your accomplishments this spring and summer, but some of the alumni in the audience may not be aware that your wife, Dr. Megan MacArthur, is also an engineer, a scientist, and an astronaut. Here at WashU, as we work to expand the roles and prominence of women and underrepresented groups in STEM, what thoughts do you have about the importance of this work and the opportunities that expanding access may create, both for individuals and for society?
I really do believe that as we look at the needs that are out there that engineering and science and otherwise can address, it really does take a very diverse pool of folks to recognize where all those needs are and then try to take advantage of the tools that we have as engineers to try to address them. And so, there are fundamentally some problems that I don't see. And I've noticed this as my wife and I are raising a son. We have a 6-year-old at this point, and there are things that she needs him to do that are different than the things that I need him to do. And I know that's a funny example, and folks have maybe some difficulty extrapolating it, but just in terms of her perception of what needs to be addressed and how we can leverage the things that we have on hand is a perspective that I didn't necessarily appreciate until I can see it from her perspective as well. If you take a step back, I described earlier that in general, I view engineering as taking advantage of our physical, our real understanding of the world and trying to leverage that to address needs that are out there. And so if you don't have that diverse pool, there's a couple of things. There are parts of the environment that and individuals' desires, things that they're passionate to understand from a physics perspective and engineering perspective that you don't necessarily address. And then there's the whole other piece, which is the needs that don't get addressed if you don't bring those two pieces together. And so, I see it in our household. My wife addresses needs that I don't, and we definitely have different ways that we solve those problems. And the same is true, I think, as a community at Washington University or as a nation. We need to definitely leverage all the skills that we have, all of the understanding that we have, and look through it from a perspective of where are all the needs as well. And we just definitely miss needs that we can easily address with the tools that we have on hand if we just if they get communicated.
So I'm going to be a bad professor and ask you a 2-part question to finish. I mean, you've had a very distinguished.
You remember the second part in case I forget it.
Okay, good. I'll keep it in mind. You've had a really distinguished career so far, but you've also got a lot more time on the planet. So tell me about the accomplishment that you're most proud of so far in your career, and then tell us a little bit about what the future holds for you.
Really the thing that I'm most proud of is that we have human spaceflight again launching from the United States. So I was a shuttle astronaut that launching. I mentioned earlier being motivated and paying attention in high school as we tried to resolve what had gone wrong with the Space Shuttle Challenger, and kind of being motivated by that kind of throughout my life. As a shuttle astronaut, when we retired the space shuttle, I was happy with the accomplishments of the space shuttle, but I saw it as a great loss from a nation perspective, because as an individual, I was motivated in the career path that I chose and the work that I did, and I thought that we had been successful at it, and we were losing that capability. Now, as NASA's chief astronaut, one of the things that I wanted to do with all of our junior astronauts, or the new folks who were coming in, is to have them be able to really savor and appreciate when we did get a chance to launch again from the United States. And that meant having them make the trek to Kazakhstan and see a Soyuz launch, and see how little of the American public or of the world in general gets to follow along with a Soyuz launch compared to what we were able to do with the shuttle launch. Now, didn't play out exactly as I had hoped, because the pandemic really limited the number of people who could attend my launch, or certainly to do that in person. But I do think that the nation was a little bit reinvigorated by seeing us launch earlier this summer and seeing us come home safely. And so I'm very proud to have been a small part of that. While we were the most visible part, obviously was tens of thousands of people involved with making that happen, that I'm just proud to have not screwed it up for those folks. In terms of what the future holds for me, I really do expect to continue to support our nation in one of those two different paths that I described earlier: the commercial space flight, which will involve a lot more people getting an opportunity to fly into low Earth orbit, and at the same time, that's a parallel path of extending our presence further out beyond low Earth orbit. That's very exciting. I'm a science engineer nerd type of individual, based on my education and the things that I've been able to be a part of. And so I'm excited about that one leg of things. But at the same time, our real role in much of this is to share our experience and to open doors so that other folks can have the opportunity as well. So I'm excited about that facet as well.
Well, Bob, you make your university, your city, and your nation proud. Congratulations for all that you've done, and we're deeply grateful for all of that terrific work. I'm going to send things back to Dean Bobick, who's got a big old pile of questions from the audience that he's going to read. So, Bob, thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chancellor Martin. I appreciate the opportunity.
And that was great. And I'm not sure if you realized when you made that video for us that was going to live forever. So we very much appreciate it. There has been a tremendous set of questions, and what I'm going to try to do, and Susan can help me navigate this a little bit, we'll try to distill them down because there's some overlap. What I want to start with has to do with, I'll say essentially, what you learned from working with SpaceX as opposed to NASA, and what are your thoughts about sort of private company doing the development of space exploration, space transport and travel versus a NASA, which is a research and government and science-based organization that has a different notion of risk, different notion of incentives, and different ways of thinking about it. As a friend of mine once said, NASA was all about 10 to the -9, and SpaceX was all about getting it done. Which is a slightly different perspective. So I was wondering how you've worked now deeply with both of them. How do you see those?
It's an interesting perspective to kind of come from. I came from an academic background, of course, finishing my PhD before transitioning into the Air Force and jumping into the test pilot school and a development program for F-22. When the time came to visit JSC, Johnson Space Center here in Houston during my interview process, I was really struck by the academic nature, if you will, of the campus. Having come from a military base straight from Edwards Air Force Base to Johnson Space Center, I felt more, I had, in my career, spent more time on university campuses than I had on military bases. And I felt more comfortable at the Johnson Space Center because it did feel like an academic campus. Now, after years of working with NASA, I certainly found situations where there were challenges with dealing with that 10 to the minus ninth aspect that you described. For example, Lego toys on the International Space Station are, it's a flammable plastic, and we have to manage those sorts of things on board the International Space Station. But it's interesting when we turn that into, they can only be out for 2 hours at a time, and then they have to be put in a bag for some period of time, so that we just don't have continuous exposure to flammable Legos on board the International Space Station, and how we manage those things. The SpaceX team on the other side of that coin needed to learn some from NASA. There's a lot of experience that NASA had, and there are things that we make sure that not only do we have a plan to get through successfully and plan for the worst to never happen, but in some cases, the worst is so catastrophic that we build a backup plan as well. And so that aspect of things, and figuring out both when that is a smart thing to do because it doesn't meet the nightly news aspect of, hey, we didn't have a plan for if that went wrong, and it would be so easy to have one and we just didn't do it. That's not a good answer. So there's that aspect of it. There's also the aspect of it that you couldn't sleep at night with yourself if you didn't have that additional safety precaution when human lives were at stake. And so we had to figure out how, as a NASA team and as a SpaceX team, to meet in the middle a little bit, so that we could get something done on a reasonable schedule, which is definitely where SpaceX is at, but at the same time, treat human life as something that, I was here at the Johnson Space Center when we lost the Space Shuttle Columbia. And when that happens, people shut down your space shuttle program. They end your space program when you do that, and you've got an American flag on the side of your vehicle. That doesn't happen quite to a company, but it will if they're doing NASA's business with that vehicle. And so I was the chief of the astronaut office a year where we lost a Progress vehicle. We lost a vehicle called Antares, which is another cargo vehicle, and SpaceX lost a vehicle. Space station kept operating. Had one of those losses been involving a crew, we would have, in my mind, most likely been shut down. And so just the risk, it looks very similar, two rocket launches that are happening side by side, in the Russian program riding the same rocket, and SpaceX's program in the future riding the same rocket, the cargo and the crew. The consequences are very different between those two different situations. And that's something can be a challenge to communicate to the company as they go forward with it. And we did find that middle ground with SpaceX and NASA to be successful.
I'll tell you, I'll relate a very funny story, because we have several alumni working at SpaceX. Maybe some of them you've met. And so I went and visited them, and I was talking to them about who they recruit. And they talk about that they recruit a lot from the race car team, from people who do a lot of work. And then they said, because we found that those engineers could really improvise. And I was thinking that I'm not exactly sure that that's NASA's motto. We can really improvise. So I thought it was an interesting, different cultural approach. We have several questions from folks that basically come down to this. My kid really wants to be an astronaut. What should I encourage her or him to think about from a major or a pursuit of study, or what they should explore? And I'm going to guess that these kids range in age from 16 to 2. But so what thoughts do you give to parents when they want to sort of engage with their children in this pursuit?
Well, Dean Babak, I'm glad you asked the question that way, because I get asked that question a lot from the student's perspective, which is, hey, what should I do to become an astronaut someday? But a lot of that responsibility lies with parents and with teachers, really. And it has to do with figuring out a way to make what can be very esoteric into something exciting, and that keeps the interest and the motivation of the student, of the child, as you go forward, right? So you don't want to make math so painful that kids just don't want to do it. You have to figure out a way, and if they're getting close to that, we have to figure out a way to make it more exciting for them. And so I was really lucky in my education that as a grade school student, I was able to both have a grade school teacher who encouraged us to predict what was going to happen and then try it out, and do that in a forum where we told the class what was going to happen, and then we either succeeded or failed in demonstrating it to them. where we took mathematics and tried to use it to build a small geodesic dome as a third and a fourth graders, just trying to cut out and build that structure. And that worked for me. That's not to say that those solutions are ones that will work for everybody, but I do think that we as folks that are going to be leaders and particularly for teachers and for parents, we need to find ways to keep students engaged. And I know that, and that's really the burden that's in front of us, is to find those things that keep their engagement. And I do it with my son, trying to chase that. And so that responsibility lies with that next level up. And as a student, if things are not engaging or interesting, you get a chance to squawk that a little bit as well, so that you can find a way where it is taught in a methodology that allows you to still have interest in it. And so that's really the most successful astronauts that we have. That's really what got them to where they are right now, is they've had a passion for what they were doing. They didn't look at the astronaut work and say, well, it's painful, but I want to fly in space, so I'm going to do all these super painful things. And then when I get to space, I'm going to have loved it. That won't happen. You'll get to space and you'll get to do more stuff that you're miserable at. So you need to figure out a way to embrace it and to love it and have passion about it, and then kind of move forward from there. And the teachers and parents have that responsibility to help with that.
Great. Inspiring students to find a passion, and if that passion aligns with being what it takes to do the astronaut work, is what's critical. We have several questions that really relate to basically an experience that a very small number of human beings get to have, and that is what it's like to be in space. And so there are three questions. The first one I'll ask was, when you're up in space and you look down at Earth, someone said, what are the three words that come to your mind? But that's a viewpoint that most of us never see. When you first saw it, or maybe when you continue to see it, what is it that you think?
For me, when each of the flights, when I've gotten into orbit, I've had a moment where I've been able to look out the window and see something that it's so inspiring or mesmerizing that it's very difficult to take your eyes off of it, because it's something you've never seen before. On my first flight, I had the responsibility to jump out of my seat and get a camera and record what was going on with our external tank, because the foam could come off and it could hit the space shuttle. And so I ended up taking just a bunch of photos of that tank. But that tank floating in the transition between darkness and daylight at the same time that it was venting was doing things that I had never seen before, in a way that from a physics perspective, it was beautiful to watch. And with the Earth passing below it, the image in and of itself had so many aspects that I could have stared at each one of them indefinitely if there wasn't a mission in front of me that I needed to go off and execute. And so that's really the message that I would say as we look back at our Earth, or we look out into space. There are situations that you find yourself in that you realize how little that you know, and your mind is trying to absorb it. And maybe that's a good description of what being mesmerized is, right? So you're looking at something that you don't understand, and you're still continuing to stare at it and absorb it in hopes of maybe understanding it as you go forward. And so I just had the same thing happen to me during spacewalks, where people had to communicate to me and that reminded me to get back to work on the work at hand when on board the International Space Station, rather than staring out at our beautiful Earth below us. I had the luxury on my second flight of taking up the cupola, which is the windowed under module of the International Space Station. There's 7 windows on that. Got to open those windows up during some spacewalks with my partner, Nick Patrick, and just that experience, and to open up the International Space Station and provide the opportunity then for people on the ground to see both the photos and to see the videos that come from that windowed module, to maybe share some of that mesmerizing Earth with them, was just an honor.
One participant put in probably a technical thing. They said, do you ever experience the overview effect during your time in space? So maybe you could tell people what that is, and then whether it ever impacted you.
So there's this effect that's attributed to astronauts. I think that the overview effect, it happens in a lot of a lot of situations, and we're just a very concrete example of it, being able to fly into space and then look back at Earth, where we just came from, and to see whether or not we have a different perspective once we get up there than we had having not been able to look down at the Earth in the same way. And folks describe that in various ways. It can be that, hey, the atmosphere is very thin and we need to definitely take care of it because there's not very much of it between Earth and space. It can be that politically there aren't really very many observable boundaries. North and South Korea is very visible at night because of a hard line between light and darkness, if you will. And so there's definitely those features that are rare on the Earth. There's also things that you can see that we have done to the Earth where we see whether it's the combination of either damage because of deforestation or burning of forests and things like that. We can see that, those scars, if you will, on board the Earth as well. And so each of us have a different perspective who've been into low Earth orbit from having looked back at our Earth and seen all those different things that gives us a different perspective coming home. In some cases, they're very important to us, and folks will appreciate that, you know, we are definitely changing things, whether the physics that people write down in research papers as to which decimal place. But when you can look down at the Earth and see a fire in the Amazon, it's clear that all that smoke is doing something. And so it's doing something to the Earth. If that burning wasn't happening, you wouldn't be able to, you certainly wouldn't see it. And that definitely has to have an effect. And so that, from our perspective, I think happens to every astronaut. For me, it was a little bit different. It was more an appreciation for all the energy that went into the rocket to get me into orbit. My overview effect was that there was a lot of energy that was going to have to be taken out of my backside in order to get me back home, right? So I was going to have to slow down a lot, and a lot of heat was going to go into the heat shield, and that's what was going to have to happen for me to get back to the people that I knew and loved back on Earth. And so that's probably the most striking example for me of that overview effect as to how far away from home I was. I can only imagine to do that from the moon must have been even more of a sensation for the astronauts who went through that.
Well, so the one other in-space experience I'll ask, and then we'll talk about the moon and beyond. So first, lots of people want to know about this stuffed animal you took up into space. Can you tell people really quickly what that was and what it meant to you and why you did it?
My spaceflight partner, Doug Hurley, on the SpaceX mission, he and I both have sons. His son, I think, he may be about to turn 11. My son is since turned 6. Those boys they're very interested in dinosaurs. And so we did have the opportunity from the SpaceX team to fly something of a zero gravity indicator. You know, when you're launching into space, it's held by a string that's kind of pulling it back. And when you get into orbit, it kind of floats out. The Soyuz crews have done that, and we had that opportunity. And so at my house, we laid out all of the dinosaurs that we had that might fit into flyable category, and that if they did come loose, they weren't going to hurt anybody as they floated around inside of the capsule. And so we brought an Apatosaurus, I guess, you know, a pretty large dinosaur in the dinosaur vernacular for one that wasn't going to hurt anybody. But we found Tremor the Apatosaurus, and that one made it through all of the stringent requirements for flammability and off-gassing. And luckily on our first try, and the boys were happy with it, between Theodore and Jack to send it up with us. And we were just proud to have them be able to send something with us. But at the same time, we were hoping to scratch that itch of finding something that, you know, kept their interest, right? Like for both of those boys, their dads have flown in space a couple of times. This time the Apatosaurus flew with us. And so it kind of put a new facet on that. And we just have been really excited that the number of people who've shown interest in that, because it's not a traditional, how fast were you going? How thick was your heat shield? And what Mach number do you get to put on your patch? It was something that folks remember about the flight and kind of piqued that interest. And maybe somebody out there, maybe one person who wasn't interested in space flight might have caught a glimmer of something when we were flying, and that Apatosaurus pink and green, or pink and turquoise, would have been something that piqued their interest long enough to catch them with something else as well.
That's great. Maybe we'll end this with this because we're running time. So you talked about how, you know, first the low flight perspective. A low flight orbit could give you a different perspective, and then spacewalk. I can't even imagine what it is when you open that hatch for the first time. I did just a couple of skydives, and when you open the door on an airplane for the very first time, it's like, wait a minute, that door is supposed to stay closed. So I'm sure the overview is even more. And then you mentioned the moon, which is as far as man has ventured. But we're now talking about Mars. And so there are a couple of questions about Mars. And first is, do you think NASA's ready? Do you think the plan is in place? I think I can guess your answer there. And then there was a personal question, which is, if asked, would you want to go?
In terms of is the plan in place, I think that the plan is a work in progress, right? So my mission to the International Space Station on the Dragon capsule, when we went into orbit, we had a rough plan about how to come home, but that plan was continued to evolve and was better when we did come home than it was when we launched. I think the plan to get to Mars has got some steps along the way that still have to come to closure for us to be ready to go on to Mars. And so, but the idea, I think, is the most important thing to be able to accomplish any big goal is to kind of put that out there and start working towards it and understand what you need in order to get there. So whether that's a stop at the moon, whether it's a gateway that allows multiple vehicles to be able to dock and some to go down to the surface of the moon as we continue to learn from that and be able to apply it to a mission to Mars, all that work needs to be done as we continue to kind of go further and further out. As far as am I ready to personally go on a mission to Mars, I think that the duration is something that folks need to really think and be serious about as they consider jumping into a mission like that. And I was asked when I was the chief of the astronaut office back in the 2012 to 2015 timeframe about building a mission profile and how we would manage that risk, and could we send crews on a one-way trip if you could provide them a household or provide them a habitat and have them be able to live there. And so, when I put that story together from and this is just Bob talking at this point, but when I put that story together as the NASA's chief astronaut, I really thought that it was important for us to build a pathway there and a pathway back. That was a critical facet and a critical piece to think about, and to think about when the folks got back, how we did that in a way that they were still healthy. And so there's radiation management that needs to go on. There's the duration that folks will be in microgravity that needs to continue, and that's happening on the International Space Station. And so all those pieces are coming together, and I am happy to be a part of building the plan to get to Mars and working in that direction. I wouldn't say that we have a plan and I'm not ready to go today, but I'm ready to go to work on that plan to get us there.
Well, that's great. I will tell you that after our first child was born, Denise said to me, a trip for 7 days is okay. So it definitely changes one's perspective, one's overview. Bob,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really fascinating. I love engaging with our alumni who do so many wonderful things and show the power that an engineering path can take you on. So thank you for joining, and I'll turn it back to Susan.
Thank you so much, Dean Bobick, Chancellor Martin. Thank you for joining us today. And Bob, thank you so much. I will echo everyone else's comments. You have made Washington University, St. Louis, and your nation so proud. And we were thrilled to be able to count you as an alum of Washington University. We really appreciate all that you've done and your time today. For all of those of you who are watching us, thank you for joining us. You will be getting an event survey later today or tomorrow. And we also hope that you will save the date for our next Wednesdays with WashU webinar on Wednesday, December 9th. How does who I am and where I live affect my health? It's going to be a wonderful conversation featuring some of our Washington University experts. So we will look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all. Goodbye.